I was so fortunate to get to know Bessie Margolin as an 18-year-old college student, and it was hard for me to understand exactly why she was such a legend. You know, I now look back at myself as so naive and so uneducated in the law and life. But as years went on after she and I developed this relationship, which was born out of our common childhood experiences, she grew up in a New Orleans orphanage, and I was in foster care supervised by the agency that succeeded the orphanage. And we were introduced because of that relationship. And so once I realized just what an extraordinary person she was, after she died in 1996, and my relationship with her had spanned about a dozen years from 1974 through the 80s, I realized there was no one who was going to write about her. So I was practicing law full-time in the Maryland Attorney General's office, small children, and I figured I'd do an appropriate thing, nominate her to the Jewish Women's Archives, to the Supreme Court Historical Society, institutions that had publications that I could just say, she's great, write about her. There's so much about Bessie's life that gives us heartwarming and really powerful lessons for all of us on how we can lead life. She did start out with great disadvantages against her. She was born in Brownsville, a neighborhood, an immigrant neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York in 1909, to Russian Jewish immigrant parents. She was the first American-born child that they had. And to escape the tough and crowded conditions in New York, the family moved to Memphis, Tennessee, where Mom in the family, after giving birth to Bessie's younger brother, the third child, about a year after that, she died and left Bessie's father alone to care for these three very young children. A Memphis rabbi learned about the Margolins' plight and recommended the children, with, of course, the father's permission, to an orphanage in New Orleans that was well established and well regarded in the Jewish community in the South. So in 1913, Bessie, at age 4, with her siblings, entered the Jewish Orphans' Home in New Orleans. And there she had a life that, albeit because of the misfortune of her family and the misfortune of the 150 or so other kids from throughout the Deep South, really was able to learn powerful lessons in social justice. It was modeled daily by rabbis who would speak in the home about very progressive notions of not only giving to children like those in the home, but seeking out the root causes for their dependency. Conditions in the workplace, amazingly enough. In an apocryphal speech she heard, because all the kids attended the anniversary celebrations, if she was listening, she would have heard at the earliest days a rabbi, a very well-respected rabbi, intoning to the throngs who would come to celebrate the orphanage's founding, that it was their duty not just to give, to support the children there, but also to address issues of poverty and conditions in the workforce, which to me is just sort of chilling that might have guided her later career. At the turn of the 20th century, a Jewish philanthropist who had made his fortune in New Orleans by the name of Isidore Newman gave the money that the orphanage had wanted to found its own training school. And by the terms of its charter in 1904, the Isidore Newman School was built first and foremost in a location separate from the home, which was also great foresight. That is, they knew they wanted to take the children out of their large building where they were right in uptown New Orleans and assimilate them into the neighborhood. Bessie, who was academically inclined, loved to write, later said how she loved to debate, thrived in this co-ed environment where she was able to compete against boys, stand her ground, was the president of the debate club, the Girls Student Council, valedictorian, and won a coveted scholarship to Newcomb College, which was then Tulane's coordinate college for women. She really thrived in that environment, and the home put her in a place where she could prove herself as a self-confident and competitive young woman. I really think that was the true gift, to have these kids see that wealth was not an impediment to academic performance when it came with equal opportunity to be there. She told people when asked during her career that she always had a penchant for debate. But I think at the earliest she was interested in becoming a teacher, a law professor, which in those days and into the 50s and 60s was a harder route for women lawyers to achieve than even a law firm career. But it was interesting, you know, I consider Bessie quite audacious, and, you know, like to say that long before there was a notorious RBG, as Justice Ginsburg is most affectionately known, there was an audacious Bessie Margolin. And one of the most audacious things she did was when she was at Newcomb as an undergraduate, she decided 2 years in this all-women's environment, albeit on Tulane's campus, that she wanted to go to law school, something no other girl from the orphanage had ever done. There were girls, a few, very few from Newman who had done so, but again, this shows that she saw herself on equal footing with the men in her Newman class who had long been going to law school, and the few women who came from quite prosperous families who had done so. And Bessie enrolled in Newcomb in 1925, spent 2 years there, ranked among the top 10 in her class, and was chosen for what's essentially a joint degree program. Bessie was able to be enrolled in Tulane's liberal arts program, which was then closed to women, because she did it in combination with being admitted to the law school. And Tulane had admitted women sporadically since the late 1880s. But there were no women when Bessie set foot on Tulane Law School's campus. She's performed so admirably at Tulane that she endeared herself to Tulane Law School's dean, Rufus Harris. And it was 1930. This was tough times in terms of getting a job. She was second in her law school class. She was civil law editor of Tulane's newly refurbished Law Review. And civil law in New Orleans is the most impressive part of the Law Review because New Orleans was and still under the Napoleonic Code. So Tulane Law School's dean was so impressed with her, wanted her to succeed. He was a Yale Law graduate, thought there might be a place for her at Yale Law School. So he personally wrote to Yale Law School's dean, Charles Clark, who later became a federal judge, and asked that Yale consider Bessie for either a job as a research assistant or preferably a fellowship that would allow her to be in graduate school for law. Dean Clark at Yale refused to consider Bessie for the fellowship because he feared it would encourage her to pursue a job teaching law, which did not exist for a woman and wouldn't for decades to come. But he agreed that she was certainly quite worthy of a job, and she was offered a position which she took as a research assistant to a highly regarded comparative law professor, Ernest Lorenzen. And while she was there, she again proved herself. She was pushed by her an advisor who she got to meet. I think you'll know his name. It was William O. Douglas, the future Supreme Court Justice, who was then a professor at Yale. And he and Lorenzen convinced Clark that she was worthy of a fellowship, and Bessie became the first woman ever awarded Yale's Sterling Fellowship for graduate studies, and that's how she got a JSD, a Doctorate of Juridical Science, essentially the equivalent of a PhD. It's the terminal degree in law, something I didn't even realize there was a terminal degree in law, and she got one. So going to Yale was huge for her in terms of making connections with the brilliant lawyers who were there, not the least of which were Jerome Frank, who helped her get a summer job, William O. Douglas, before whom she would later argue all 24 of her Supreme Court arguments. And it really put her on a path to be on the track for elite legal practice. It's true, Bessie had a couple strikes against her. She was a woman graduating from law school with the Yale Law degree in 1933. She was also Jewish, which made it that much harder for the Wall Street law firms. And she was from the South, which I'm sure added some burden in terms of a job in a prestigious Wall Street firm. One of the things that brought Bessie to Washington in the first place was a temporary job. It was the best that she could do when she was graduating from Yale in 1933 with these Ivy League credentials, having studied under William O. Douglas. She did her thesis at Yale on the bankruptcy laws. But when law firms learned that B. Margolin was Bessie and not Bob, the best offer she got in a law firm was as a librarian, and Bessie was not going to have any of that. So being in Washington, Bessie was there as the New Deal was blossoming in D.C., and Bessie managed to get a job at the Tennessee Valley Authority, which Congress had just created to carry out FDR's New Deal vision of supplying electricity to the Tennessee Valley's most impoverished residents. She was there for 6 years, where Bessie cut her teeth on learning how a case goes from the trial to the Supreme Court on constitutional issues. It was a serendipitous and wonderful training ground where she was the only woman and with the most brilliant legal minds in the country at the time. So after Bessie, who was credited with materially shaping the briefs that convinced the Supreme Court to uphold its first New Deal agency at the Supreme Court, when those two cases were resolved by 1938, Bessie was ready to move on. There was nothing, I'm sure she realized, that the TVA would offer in terms of legal experience that would compare with the groundbreaking New Deal constitutional law that she'd been working on. There was another great challenge awaiting her. The Fair Labor Standards Act at the Labor Department had been enacted, and Frances Perkins was ready to, the first woman cabinet secretary, was ready to put teeth into the new law. So Bessie was able, essentially a lateral move from the TVA to the Labor Department, where she was there as the law was challenged on every facet, from the most rudimentary issues of how they could, litigants could obtain service on the Labor Department if they were suing the government, and issues involving every facet of every word on the first time the federal government invoked Commerce Clause powers to prohibit child labor and to mandate a minimum wage and overtime. That's how Bessie came into the labor laws and the Fair Labor Standards Act. It was the New Deal, a new law, and she was drawn to the social justice of making sure that people were paid a full wage for an honest day's work.